The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn floorboards of the First National Bank of Silver City, as Catherine Miller traced her fingers over the ornate frame of her wedding daguerreotype. 3 weeks had passed since her husband Samuel's death, and the bank's marble halls felt more like a mausoleum than the proud institution he'd built. Through the dusty windows, she watched tumbleweeds dance across the empty street, their wild movements matching the chaos in her mind since discovering the truth about the man she'd married. The sound of spurs clicking against wood drew her attention to James Wilson, her husband's former business partner, lingering in the doorway with an unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Miller, my deepest condolences. I trust you've had time to consider my offer to purchase Samuel's shares in the bank?" His words dripped with false sympathy, but Catherine knew what he really wanted: the location of the stolen gold that had mysteriously vanished the night of Samuel's death. Catherine clutched the daguerreotype closer, her thumb unconsciously tracing the strange markings Samuel had scratched into its copper backing plate. She'd discovered them only yesterday, hidden beneath the worn velvet of the frame, a series of cryptic symbols that looked like a crude map mixed with Spanish letters. "I'm afraid I'll need more time to review the estate papers, Mr. Wilson. My husband's affairs were quite complex." The memories of that terrible night flooded back, finding Samuel slumped over his desk, the telegram from the Treasury Department crushed in his lifeless hand. The message had been clear. They knew about the stolen Federal Reserve shipment, and agents were already en route. But the gold had vanished, along with any trace of Samuel's involvement in its theft. Only these mysterious scratches remained, like a final riddle from a man Catherine thought she'd known. In the street below, a group of riders approached through the shimmering heat waves. The sun glinted off brass badges pinned to dusty coats. Treasury agents, no doubt. Catherine's heart raced as she noticed William Thompson, the local sheriff, among them. He'd been asking too many questions lately, circling closer to a truth she herself was only beginning to understand. Her time was running out. "Your husband was more than just a banker, Mrs. Miller," Wilson said softly, taking a step closer. "He was a visionary who understood that borders, between states, between right and wrong, they're all just lines drawn in shifting sand." His hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a gesture that might have seemed casual if not for the deadly intent in his eyes. "Those lines are about to shift again. Best make sure you're on the right side when they do." Catherine's fingers found the derringer hidden in the folds of her black morning dress. Samuel had insisted she learn to shoot it, though she'd never understood why until now. The weight of the tiny gun gave her courage as she met Wilson's gaze. "My husband may have been many things, Mr. Wilson, but he was never a man to leave matters unfinished. I suggest you remember that." A commotion erupted in the street as the Treasury agents dismounted. Catherine used the distraction to slip the daguerreotype into her reticule and move toward the bank's rear exit. She'd spent the last 3 weeks playing the grieving widow, but now the real performance would begin. Samuel's secrets were encoded in those strange marks, and she intended to decipher them before anyone else did. The desert beyond Silver City's boundaries beckoned, a vast canvas of red rock and shadow, where ancient Spanish explorers had once searched for legendary treasures. Catherine knew that somewhere in that wilderness, her husband had hidden enough stolen gold to buy a small kingdom. But more importantly, he'd hidden the truth about who he really was, and who she would need to become to survive what was coming. As she slipped through the bank's back door into the gathering dusk, Catherine caught a glimpse of another rider watching from the shadows of an alley. Jake Davis, the notorious gunslinger who'd been seen with Samuel in the days before his death. Their eyes met briefly, and Davis touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respect or warning. Either way, Catherine knew the game was about to begin, and she intended to learn its rules very quickly. Catherine urged her horse forward through the deepening twilight, the leather satchel containing the daguerreotype pressed close against her side. The methodical clip-clop of hooves on hard-packed earth provided a steady rhythm to match her racing thoughts. She'd spent the last 3 hours in Samuel's office at the bank, searching through his papers for any additional clues, but found only more questions, including a letter addressed to someone named William in Tombstone that made cryptic references to the old mission ruins. The cool evening air carried the scent of sage and creosote as she guided her mount toward the small adobe house she'd shared with Samuel. It sat on the outskirts of Silver City, its weathered walls glowing orange in the last rays of sunset. But something wasn't right. The front door stood slightly ajar, casting an awkward shadow across the porch where she was certain she'd locked it that morning. Catherine drew her deceased husband's Remington from her saddle holster, approaching cautiously. Inside, the house had been thoroughly searched. Drawers hung open, papers scattered across the floor, and the painting above the fireplace mantel hung askew. But the intruder had missed the most important thing: the hollow space behind the loose adobe brick in the kitchen wall where Catherine kept her emergency funds and her father's pocket watch. As she retrieved these items, bootsteps creaked on the porch behind her. "Evening, Mrs. Bradley," came a smooth voice she didn't recognize. Catherine turned to find a well-dressed man in a black coat standing in her doorway, flanked by two others. "I'm Thomas Morrison, United States Treasury Department. We need to have a conversation about your husband's banking activities." His badge glinted in the fading light as he held it up, but his smile didn't reach his cold eyes. Catherine's mind raced as she maintained her composure, carefully sliding the watch and money into her pocket. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about my husband's business dealings, Mr. Morrison." Samuel kept his work private. She moved slowly toward the back door, but one of Morrison's men shifted to block her path. The agent's smile widened slightly as he produced a familiar-looking document. "That's interesting, because we found this deed in your name for a rather substantial property purchase near the old Spanish territories." Morrison tapped the paper meaningfully. "Signed just 3 days before your husband's unfortunate passing. Care to explain how a banker's wife came by that kind of money?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke, and Catherine realized she'd severely underestimated how quickly the federal authorities would move. Through the window, she caught movement in the gathering darkness. A rider passing slowly by, the distinctive silhouette of Jake Davis. He paused briefly, and Catherine saw him raise something in his hand. Suddenly, a bottle crashed through the front window, flames erupting as the makeshift explosives scattered burning kerosene across the floor. The Treasury agents dove for cover, and Catherine seized her chance, bolting through the chaos toward the back door. She vaulted onto her horse as shouts and gunfire erupted behind her. Spurring the animal hard, Catherine rode into the desert night, the burning house casting an orange glow across the landscape. She knew she couldn't return to Silver City now. Her careful facade of ignorance had crumbled, and both the law and Samuel's former associates would be hunting her in earnest. But Jake Davis's intervention suggested there was more to this deadly game than simple theft and greed. The mysterious symbols on the daguerreotype seemed to burn in her mind as Catherine rode south, toward the ancient Spanish territories. Samuel had always been fascinated by the old stories of lost missions and forgotten treasures. Now she understood why. They weren't just stories to him, but elaborate puzzle pieces in whatever scheme had ultimately cost him his life. And somewhere in the vastness of the border territories, Catherine knew she would find the truth, if she could stay alive long enough to unravel it. As the lights of Silver City faded behind her, Catherine reached into her satchel and withdrew the wedding photograph. In the pale moonlight, the strange markings seemed to shift and change, like the shadows of the desert itself. She thought of Jake Davis's unexpected assistance and wondered what other allies, or enemies, awaited her on the trail ahead. One thing was certain. The quiet life she'd known as a banker's wife was over. The woman who emerged from this journey would be someone else entirely. The desert wind carried whispers of approaching riders, making Catherine's mare shift nervously beneath her. She tucked the daguerreotype away and guided her horse off the main trail, seeking shelter behind a cluster of weathered rocks. The moon cast long shadows across the scrubland as 3 mounted figures passed by on the road below, their silhouettes dark against the silver-lit landscape. She recognized William Turner's distinctive hat, one of Samuel's former business associates who'd been asking too many questions at the funeral. The cold night air bit through her riding coat as Catherine waited, counting heartbeats until the riders disappeared into the darkness. Jake's warning about William's involvement with a dangerous gang of treasure hunters echoed in her thoughts. Her husband's cryptic final words about Spanish gold and sacred ground had seemed like fever dreams at the time, but now every detail felt weighted with hidden meaning. Dawn found her crossing a dry riverbed, the morning sun painting the cliffs in shades of amber and rose. Catherine consulted the crude map she'd pieced together from studying the markings on the photograph. If her calculations were correct, the old mission ruins should lie just beyond the next ridge. Sarah Miller traced her fingers over the worn daguerreotype, studying the strange markings etched into its silver surface. 3 weeks had passed since her husband William's death, and what began as grief had transformed into a desperate race against time. The symbols, barely visible in the wedding portrait's tarnished edges, seemed to mock her with their mysterious significance. Her comfortable life in Silver City had crumbled when federal agents arrived at her door, demanding to know about William's connection to a string of bank robberies across the territory. The autumn wind whistled through the cracks of her study window as she packed essential supplies into her saddlebags. William's criminal associates wouldn't be far behind the federal agents. Just yesterday, she'd spotted Jake Thompson, her husband's former business partner, watching her house from the shadows of the Mercantile. The man's scarred face and cold eyes held none of the warmth she remembered from social gatherings in better days. He knew something about the stolen gold, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Catherine Davis, her closest friend and the town's telegraph operator, had secretly passed her a warning that morning. 3 men, matching the description of William's old gang, had been asking questions in Tombstone. They were working their way north, methodically searching every town where William had conducted business. Sarah knew she couldn't wait any longer. The mysterious symbols in the photograph were her only hope of finding the truth before they found her. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Through the lace curtains, she recognized Thomas Wilson, the federal marshal who'd been investigating William's case. Unlike the others, he'd shown her unexpected kindness, perhaps seeing past her status as a banker's widow to recognize the genuine shock and confusion in her eyes. But she couldn't trust anyone now, not with what she'd discovered in William's private ledger the night before. The leather-bound book had revealed a web of corruption far deeper than simple theft. William had been tracking something ancient, something tied to old Spanish land grants and forgotten mission ruins. The numbers in his ledger corresponded to geographical coordinates, and the symbols in their wedding portrait matched markings he'd sketched beside entries about a lost treasure dating back to the conquistadors. Her husband's obsession had led him down a dark path, but Sarah was beginning to suspect he'd been trying to right an old wrong. As Marshal Wilson's knocking grew more insistent, Sarah slipped out the back door with her saddlebags and mounted her horse. The desert stretched before her, a vast canvas of red earth and shadow. According to William's notes, the first set of coordinates led to an abandoned mission near the Mexican border. She'd need to reach it before Jake Thompson and his men figured out what the symbols meant. The mission held more than just gold. It contained evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching back decades. James Miller, her brother-in-law, and the only member of William's family she still trusted, waited for her at the agreed meeting point outside town. A former cavalry scout, James had agreed to help her navigate the treacherous border territory. His expertise would be essential. The lands they needed to cross were notorious for bandits, and the ancient Spanish trails were easy to lose in the shifting landscape. The sun had barely risen when they spotted the first riders on their trail. Samuel Johnson, the most violent of William's former associates, led a group of 4 men along the ridge above them. Sarah and James were forced to abandon the main trail, taking shelter in a narrow canyon where the morning shadows still held sway. As they waited, Sarah shared what she'd learned about William's final days. How he'd discovered that the stolen gold was merely a small part of a centuries-old secret. The deeper they rode into the border territory, the more Sarah understood why William had become obsessed with the mystery. Ancient petroglyphs marked canyon walls, their patterns eerily similar to the symbols in their wedding portrait. Each discovery led to another clue, another piece of a puzzle that seemed to reach back to the earliest days of Spanish exploration. But with every mile they covered, the number of pursuers grew. Federal agents and criminals alike converged on their trail, drawn by rumors of lost treasure and hidden truth. The first real confrontation came at dusk, when Jake Thompson's men caught up with them near a waterhole. The ensuing gunfight left 2 of Thompson's riders wounded, but Sarah and James were forced to abandon most of their supplies in their escape. As they rode through the night, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if William had known what would happen. If his elaborate trail of clues had been designed not just to lead to the gold, but to expose something even more valuable. The truth about who really controlled the territory's destiny. The morning sun revealed the harsh reality of their situation as Sarah and James assessed their depleted supplies. The water canteen was nearly empty, and they had only a few strips of dried beef left. But it was the daguerreotype that consumed Sarah's attention as she traced the peculiar markings with a dusty finger. The symbols seemed to point toward Silver City, though their path would take them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the territory. James studied the horizon with his spyglass, his weathered face creased with concern. "Two riders coming from the east," he reported grimly. "Might be Thompson's men, might be the feds. Either way, we can't stay here." Sarah noticed how he favored his left arm, where a bullet had grazed him during the previous night's encounter. The former cavalry scout wasn't as young as he used to be, but his tracking skills had kept them alive so far. They pushed their exhausted horses through narrow canyons where the red rock seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Sarah's mind wandered to William's last days, remembering how he'd spent hours in his study, poring over old Spanish maps and documents. She'd dismissed it as the obsession of a dying man, but now every detail seemed significant. The way he'd insisted on wearing his wedding clothes for that final daguerreotype, positioning himself just so, ensuring the background contained those cryptic markings. At midday, they encountered an abandoned mission, its adobe walls crumbling beneath the merciless sun. Inside, they found evidence of recent occupation, still warm ashes and discarded provisions. More troubling were the fresh markings carved into the mission's altar, symbols matching those in the photograph. Someone else was following the same trail, someone who understood the code William had left behind. While James tended to the horses, Sarah discovered a hidden chamber beneath the mission's floor. Descending the narrow stairs, she found walls covered in Spanish text and familiar symbols. Among them was a name that made her blood run cold: Samuel Drake. William's former business partner had vanished months before his death, taking with him a fortune in railroad bonds. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture far more complex than missing gold bars. The sound of approaching horses sent them scrambling for cover. Through a crack in the mission wall, Sarah watched as Thomas Reed, the federal marshal who'd been investigating William's bank, dismounted with two deputies. They moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they were looking for. Sarah's hand tightened around the daguerreotype. Whatever William had hidden, it was clearly worth more than she'd imagined. James led them out through a hidden passage he'd discovered, but their escape was complicated by fresh tracks in the dirt, boot prints heading towards Silver City. Someone had been watching the mission, waiting to see who would find it. The hunters had become the hunted, and Sarah realized that William's elaborate puzzle was more than a path to redemption. It was a confession written in code, meant to expose a conspiracy that reached from border towns to the highest offices in the territory. As they rode toward the setting sun, Sarah unfolded a letter she'd found hidden in the mission's altar. Written in William's precise hand, it revealed a web of corruption involving railroad contracts, land grants, and stolen Spanish artifacts. The gold bars were merely a small part of a much larger scheme. William had been both participant and witness, and in his final days, he'd created an intricate trail of clues that would either save his soul or condemn those who'd forced his hand. The distant sound of gunfire echoed through the canyons as multiple groups of pursuers converged on their location. Sarah tucked the letter securely inside her bodice, next to the daguerreotype that had started it all. Ahead lay Silver City and the promise of answers, but first they would have to survive the night. The moon rose over the desert, casting long shadows that seemed to point the way forward, while behind them, the past refused to stay buried in the sand. The night grew treacherous as Sarah and Jake guided their horses through a narrow arroyo, the moonlight barely penetrating the deep shadows. The daguerreotype seemed to burn against her skin, its hidden symbols becoming clearer in her mind with each passing mile. She'd noticed how the peculiar arrangement of flowers in the wedding portrait matched markings she'd seen on old Spanish maps in William's study, but the connection had eluded her until now. Jake pulled his horse alongside hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "Two riders coming up from the south, probably Thomas's men. There's a cave system ahead that might give us cover." His years as a former Texas Ranger had taught him to read the landscape like a book, though Sarah wondered if his past connections to William's schemes ran deeper than he'd admitted. They found shelter in a limestone cavern, its entrance obscured by scraggly mesquite. While Jake kept watch, Sarah studied the daguerreotype by lantern light. The photographer's backdrop, she realized, wasn't random. It depicted the silhouette of a mountain range she recognized from their journey to Silver City. The desert sun beat mercilessly upon Sarah Wilson's back as she crouched behind a weathered boulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ancient Spanish mission ruins loomed before her, its crumbling adobe walls casting long shadows across the parched earth. She clutched the mysterious daguerreotype in trembling hands, studying once more the peculiar markings her late husband had cleverly hidden within the image. Symbols that now seemed to align perfectly with the mission's architectural features. From her vantage point, she could see James Thompson's gang spreading out across the mission grounds, their rifles glinting in the harsh light. The notorious outlaw had been her husband's secret partner in the bank heist, and now he was determined to claim all the gold for himself. Sarah's fingers brushed against the loaded Colt in her skirt pocket. A gift from Samuel Miller, the gruff but kind-hearted prospector who'd become her unlikely ally in this desperate quest. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pulse quicken. Through the shimmering heat waves, she recognized the distinctive white hat of William Davis, the federal marshal who'd been pursuing her since Fort Worth. He'd started as her hunter but had gradually come to suspect there was more to her story than a simple case of a widow absconding with stolen money. Their last encounter in Silver City had ended with him secretly warning her about Thompson's approaching gang. Inside the mission's shadowy interior, Katherine Johnson worked feverishly to decipher the final clues. The scholarly widow had recognized the symbols as an ancient Spanish cipher, and Sarah had promised her a share of the gold in exchange for her expertise. But Katherine's hands shook as she sketched in her notebook, knowing that Thompson's men were closing in. The two women had formed an unlikely friendship, bound by their shared loss and determination to forge their own destinies. A shot rang out, sending chips of adobe flying near Sarah's head. She glimpsed Jake Miller, Thompson's trigger-happy lieutenant, moving along the mission's upper level. The man had a personal vendetta against her, blaming her husband's betrayal for his brother's death during the original heist. Sarah had tried explaining that her husband had been attempting to return the gold when he died, but Jake's thirst for revenge had only grown stronger. Samuel's voice carried across the courtyard, gruff but urgent. "Sarah! The symbols. They're not just a map, they're a warning." The old prospector had been studying similar markings in abandoned mines across the territory. The Spanish didn't just hide their gold here, they rigged the whole place to collapse. The revelation struck her like lightning. Her husband hadn't hidden the gold here. He'd discovered the trap and been trying to prevent Thompson from claiming an even greater treasure. Marshal Davis's voice boomed through the mission grounds. "Thompson, you're surrounded. Federal agents are positioned on every side. But Sarah knew it was a bluff. She'd seen him riding alone. William was trying to buy them time, still uncertain whether to arrest her or help her prove her innocence. The complex web of loyalty and justice that had entangled them all was pulling tighter by the moment. The tension finally exploded into chaos as Thompson's gang opened fire from multiple positions. Sarah used the distraction to slip inside the mission, finding Katherine hunched over the ancient stones. "The markings," the scholar whispered. "They show a ceremonial chamber beneath the chapel, but the entrance mechanism is designed to bring down the entire structure." Sarah's mind raced, remembering her husband's last words about redemption and sacrifice. A bullet splintered the wooden beam above them as Jake burst into the chamber, his face twisted with hatred. "Your husband was a coward who got my brother killed," he snarled. "Now you'll both die in this tomb." But Sarah saw the fear in his eyes as the ground began to tremble. The ancient stones groaned as centuries-old mechanisms awakened, set in motion by their frantic searching. The Spanish engineer's final trap was beginning to trigger. Samuel appeared at the doorway, bleeding from a shoulder wound but standing firm. "The support pillars are failing," he shouted. "Thompson's men triggered the collapse while searching the lower chambers." Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. She grabbed Katherine's research notes and shoved them into the scholar's hands, pushing her toward Samuel. "Run! I'll hold them off." Her husband had died trying to prevent this tragedy. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. Sarah pressed her back against the ancient stone wall, drawing her husband's old Colt revolver as dust and pebbles rained down from the trembling ceiling. Jake advanced with his weapon raised, but she could see uncertainty in his stance as larger rocks began to fall. The chamber's golden artifacts cast eerie shadows in the flickering lantern light, a reminder of the greed that had brought them all to this deadly moment. The ground lurched violently, and Sarah heard Katherine and Samuel's footsteps retreating down the corridor. Jake fired wildly, his shot going wide as he struggled to keep his balance. "Your husband stole everything from us," he shouted over the deafening rumble. We were supposed to split the Spanish gold fairly. Sarah's mind raced to William's final letter, understanding now why he'd chosen to hide the truth about the treasure's location. William knew what this gold does to men's souls, Sarah called back, edging toward a narrow side passage. He saw how it corrupted Thomas and James, turned brother against brother. That's why he died protecting its secret. The chamber shuddered again, and an enormous support beam cracked overhead. Jake's eyes darted upward, real fear replacing his rage as the ancient trap continued its inexorable sequence. Sarah seized her chance, diving through the passage as chunks of ceiling crashed down behind her. She could hear Jake's cursing fade as she ran, following the faint marks William had left years ago, symbols that matched their wedding daguerreotype. Her lantern swung wildly, illuminating primitive paintings on the walls that told of the treasure's true purpose. Not mere wealth, but sacred artifacts meant to unite warring peoples. The passage opened into a vast circular chamber, its walls lined with weathered statues of Spanish missionaries and indigenous leaders. At its center stood a simple stone altar, and upon it lay not gold bars, but a centuries-old peace treaty written on gold leaf parchment. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted it, understanding at last why William had given his life to keep it hidden. This was worth far more than mere gold. It was proof that peace between peoples was possible. Heavy footsteps echoed behind her as Jake staggered into the chamber, covered in dust and bleeding from a gash on his forehead. But before he could raise his gun, Samuel appeared from another passage, Catherine beside him clutching her research notes. "It's over, Jake," Samuel said firmly, his own weapon steady. "Thompson's men are trapped in the lower chambers. The federal agents are already at the surface. There's only one way out now." The chamber's great dome groaned ominously as ancient gears continued their work. Sarah stepped forward, holding the golden treaty. "William tried to tell you, Jake." This treasure was never about money. It was about healing old wounds, bringing justice to the border territories. Help us preserve it, and you can still honor your brother's memory. Tears streaked through the dust on Jake's face as his gun hand began to lower. A massive tremor shook the chamber, and Sarah saw the decision crystallize in Jake's eyes. He tucked his revolver away and grabbed a support beam. "The eastern passage is reinforced," he said hoarsely. "If we hurry, we can make it." Together they ran, former enemies united by survival, as the temple began its final collapse. Sarah clutched the treaty to her chest, knowing William would be proud. Some treasures were worth more than gold, and some redemptions came at the very last moment. They emerged into the desert twilight just as the ground sealed itself behind them, centuries of Spanish engineering completing its ultimate purpose. The federal agents waited with rifles ready, but Samuel stepped forward with Catherine's research notes. "This site is now a protected historical landmark," he announced, "and we have proof that what lies buried here should stay buried." Sarah watched as Jake surrendered quietly, his face peaceful for the first time since she'd known him. As the sun set over the border territory, Sarah studied the daguerreotype one last time before handing it to Catherine for safekeeping. The symbols that had led them here would help protect the treaty's location, ensuring it would only be found when the time was right. William had understood that some treasures weren't meant to be possessed, but to teach us about who we truly were. In the end, the real gold had been in the hearts of those who chose right over riches. Sarah watched the federal agents lead Jake away as the desert wind kicked up swirls of red dust around them. Though he'd chosen surrender over violence, his knowledge of William's other hidden caches meant this wasn't truly over. Catherine carefully wrapped the daguerreotype in a leather pouch, her archaeologist's hands treating the artifact with reverence. "The Spanish weren't just protecting gold," she explained softly. "These markings suggest they were guarding something far more dangerous." Samuel conferred with his fellow agents while consulting Sarah's decoded notes. The symbols hadn't just led to this site. They formed a map of connected locations stretching from Silver City to the Mexican border. Each point corresponded to an old Spanish mission, and if William had discovered this pattern before his death, others might be close to unraveling it too. Sarah felt a chill despite the desert heat as she realized her late husband's obsession went deeper than she'd imagined. That evening in Tombstone, they gathered in Catherine's study at the university. Maps and documents covered every surface as she explained the full scope of William's discovery. The scorching desert sun cast long shadows across the ancient Spanish mission as Sarah Wilson finally understood the true meaning behind the cryptic symbols on her wedding daguerreotype. The worn stone walls before her matched the intricate pattern she'd been studying for weeks, a series of interconnected crosses and circles that her late husband William had secretly photographed during their ceremony, knowing it would lead to this very spot. Behind her, the sound of approaching horses made her pulse quicken. She recognized Jake Thompson's distinctive whistle, William's former partner in crime who had been pursuing her relentlessly since learning of the hidden gold. The federal marshals weren't far behind either, their dust cloud visible on the horizon as they closed in from the opposite direction. Sarah's fingers traced the ancient carvings, remembering William's final words before the fever took him. "The mission holds more than just prayers, my love." Now she understood. He'd hidden the stolen gold bars within these hallowed walls, using the old Spanish symbols as his guide. But he'd also left her a choice about what kind of person she wanted to be. The sound of boots on stone made her turn. Jake Thompson stood in the mission doorway, his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. "Mrs. Wilson, I believe you found something that rightfully belongs to me and my associates," he drawled, hand hovering near his pistol. Behind him, two more men, Samuel Davis and James Miller, spread out to block any escape. "The gold was never yours to begin with, Jake," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "William stole it from the very people he was supposed to protect, honest folks who trusted him with their savings. I won't let you compound that sin." Her hand slipped into her skirt pocket, fingers closing around the small derringer William had given her. Thomas Johnson, the lead federal marshal, chose that moment to appear at the mission's side entrance, flanked by his deputies. "Nobody move," he commanded, leveling his rifle. "Mrs. Wilson, we know you've discovered your husband's cache. This can end peacefully if you cooperate." His weathered face showed both determination and compassion. He'd been tracking this case since the bank robbery 2 years ago. Sarah looked between the opposing forces, criminals seeking ill-gotten gains on one side, the law demanding justice on the other. But she had discovered something else in her journey across the desert territories, a chance for redemption. The mission housed more than just gold. It was also home to a small orphanage run by Sister Mary Catherine, caring for children left parentless by the harsh frontier life. "The gold isn't here anymore," Sarah announced clearly, drawing surprised looks from both groups. "I found it 3 days ago and had it moved to where it could do the most good. It's being used to establish a proper school and medical clinic for the children of Silver City. The papers are already signed and the money legally transferred." Jake's face contorted with rage as he drew his pistol, but Marshal Johnson was faster. The shot echoed off the mission walls as Jake stumbled backward, his weapon clattering to the floor. His companions quickly raised their hands in surrender, knowing their chance at the gold was lost. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Wilson," Johnson said softly as his deputies took the criminals into custody. "William's victims will be glad to know their losses helped build something meaningful." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She had carried her husband's guilt for so long, but now she had found a way to turn his crime into something positive. Sister Mary Catherine appeared from the mission's inner chambers, a gentle smile on her weathered face. "The children would love to meet their benefactor," she said warmly. "You've given them a future they never dreamed possible." Sarah followed her inside, leaving behind the ghosts of the past and embracing a new purpose. In the years that followed, Sarah Wilson became known not as the widow of a thief, but as the founder of Silver City's finest school. The mysterious symbols in her wedding photograph remained as a reminder that redemption could be found in the most unexpected places, and that one person's choice to do right could ripple outward to touch countless lives. The old mission still stands today, its ancient walls holding memories of both sin and salvation. Local children sometimes whisper stories about hidden treasures, but the real gold lies in the legacy of learning and healing that grew from one woman's decision to break the cycle of greed and violence that had claimed her husband's soul. Within the schoolhouse Sarah built, a framed daguerreotype hangs on the wall. Not the one with the cryptic symbols, but a new photograph showing smiling children gathered around their teacher. It serves as a reminder that the greatest treasures aren't found in gold bars or secret maps, but in the chance to make right what once went wrong. Decades after Sarah's school was established, the legacy of her choice continued to shape Silver City in unexpected ways. In 1899, during renovations of the old schoolhouse, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards containing a leather-bound journal. Inside, Sarah had documented not just the story of the gold and her transformation, but also detailed accounts of the students whose lives she'd touched over the years. Among those pages was a letter addressed to James, her husband's former partner, who had eventually turned himself in after witnessing how Sarah had transformed their ill-gotten gains into something meaningful. From his cell in the Tombstone Territorial Prison, he had written to her of his own journey toward redemption, inspired by her example. The letter revealed how he'd helped other inmates learn to read and write, starting a small prison education program that would later spread throughout the territory. Elizabeth, one of Sarah's first students and now the school's headmistress, carefully preserved these documents as a testament to how a single act of conscience could create ripples across generations. She often shared with new teachers how Sarah had faced down William's former gang, not with violence, but with unwavering determination to create something lasting from the ashes of her husband's misdeeds. The mysterious symbols from the daguerreotype, while never fully decoded, became part of local folklore. Some said they were ancient Spanish markers. Others believed they were Native American signs. But their true significance lay in how they had led Sarah to choose a different path. The mission where she had made her fateful decision became a sanctuary for others seeking to leave behind lives of violence and deceit. In Fort Worth, where William's former associates had once plotted to recover the gold, a small museum now housed artifacts from the era, including a collection of letters between Sarah and Catherine, the wife of another gang member. These letters chronicled how Catherine, following Sarah's example, had established a shelter for women escaping difficult circumstances in Abilene, creating another thread in the tapestry of redemption that spread across the territory. The schoolhouse itself evolved into something greater than Sarah could have imagined. By 1905, it had grown into an academy that welcomed students from across the border territories, many of them children of former outlaws seeking better lives for their families. The original classroom, preserved as a memorial, still held the simple wooden desk where Sarah had first taught reading to dusty-faced children of miners and ranchers. Thomas, the federal agent who had pursued Sarah across the desert, became an unlikely ally in her educational mission. In his later years, he would visit the school annually to share cautionary tales about the true cost of outlaw life, while emphasizing how Sarah's courage in choosing a different path had inspired him to focus on prevention rather than punishment in his law enforcement career. Even the desert itself seemed transformed by the story. The harsh landscape that had once concealed stolen gold now harbored waypoints for travelers seeking new beginnings. The old Spanish mission became a symbol of transformation, its bells ringing out across the years as a reminder that redemption was possible even in the most hardened hearts. In her final years, Sarah would often sit in the school's garden, watching new generations of children play in the shadow of the mission walls. The gold that had once driven men to violence had been transformed into something far more precious, a legacy of learning and hope that continued to grow long after the last of William's gang had passed into history. Today, visitors to Silver City can still trace the path of Sarah's journey from desperate widow to beloved teacher. The school archives contain photographs of each graduating class, their faces reflecting the diversity of the border territories and the enduring power of one woman's choice to transform tragedy into triumph. Among these faces are the descendants of those first students, carrying forward the lesson that true wealth lies not in hidden treasure, but in the courage to choose a better path. In the twilight years following Sarah's establishment of the school, a young man named Thomas, one of her first students who had grown into the town's sheriff, discovered an old leather journal hidden within the mission's crumbling adobe walls. The weathered pages contained William's final confession, detailing not just the locations of other stolen caches, but the names of corrupt officials who had enabled his gang's reign of terror across the territories. Sarah, now silver-haired but still sharp-minded, worked with Thomas to piece together the journal's cryptic references. Together they uncovered a web of corruption that stretched from Silver City to Fort Worth, implicating several prominent families who had built their fortunes on William's stolen gold. The revelation sent shockwaves through the border communities, forcing many to confront their own complicity in the territory's violent past. One by one, the stolen caches were recovered and returned to their rightful owners or their descendants.